This is Flatiron by Shay S. and Isra C., who you may know from games like The Red Cathedral, The White Castle.
And those are games that pack a lot of game in a tiny box. Now they've got a bigger box with less game because this is a game for 1 to 2 players only. So what do we think? Hi everybody, I'm Amy, this is my wife Maggie, and together we are ThinkerThemer, and we review games from 2 different perspectives. I'm all about the mechanics and Maggie is all about the theme. And if you enjoy board game reviews, particularly the latest and greatest board games, then subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you'll know when we drop a new review.
Yeah, today we've got Flatiron, which is all about taking us back to 1900s, where we're going to be in New York City, the Big Apple, constructing the Flatiron, that iconic triangular building. And so we're taking on the role of different companies competing to help build up the Flatiron level by level, collecting a lot of reputation along the way. And whoever does that in the best possible way will be the winner.
Now, as we mentioned in the intro, this game plays only 1 player solo or 2 players. So for the most part, it is a 2-player game where you're playing head to head. Now, on a player's turn, the actions are really simple actually, because we only have a single worker. This is your architect, and your architect is either going to go to one of the streets, Broadway, 23rd Street, 5th Avenue, or 22nd Street, that exist around the Flatiron as worker placement spots, or the City Hall. So for example, if I were to go to Broadway, I can do one of 3 actions. The first thing I can do is I can draft the card that exists there. Now it's interesting because Broadway has its own deck of cards that are shuffled and placed here face up, but the card on top refers to 23rd Street, which indicates where it's going to go on the player's board, because your player board has 4 different columns relating to each of these streets, where you're going to be building up an engine in order to activate that engine and do a lot of actions on your turn. So for example, if I were to purchase this card for $2 as shown on the card, I now have to place it in the 23rd Street column. But what's interesting is I get to decide whether I want to keep it for its top action or its bottom action. So depending on what I choose, it's going to slide in here and now become part of this column where I can have a maximum of 3 cards. Some of the cards also have baked in reputation, and that's important because the more powerful actions that you put into your tableau, the more reputation it's going to cost you. And what you're trying to do by the end of the game is you're trying to balance each one of the columns with negative and positive reputation, and ideally be net positive to earn you extra victory points at the end of the game. The second option that I can take when I go to one of these streets, so when I go to Broadway, is I can activate my column of Broadway cards. At the moment, I don't have any cards, so it would just activate the things on my player board. The first thing is that I can build a pillar. So I could spend $3 to build one of these pillars and place it onto my board. And the second thing I could do is pay $3 to place 2 pillars out onto the first floor of the Flatiron, because ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to place 3 pillars of different colors onto each floor and then build up level by level until the roof is placed. When the roof is placed, the game ends immediately. There's no extra turns. So we're both trying to work towards getting as many points before that happens. The third thing you can do is a bit of a distress action. You can just take 2 coins. But alternatively, instead of going to one of these streets, you can go to City Hall. Now, City Hall will also give you 2 coins if you want them. You can activate the newspaper there. And newspapers are interesting because newspapers are this type of bonus token that you'll get along the way, predominantly from chasing down this newspaper boy on the victory point track. But when players have these and they want to use one, it acts as like a supplementary action on their turn. And when they use it, it replaces the one that's currently in City Hall. So when you go to City Hall, that action is always changing. And finally, when you go to City Hall, you can buy one of these decree cards. Now, these are end game victory points for different scoring conditions, and they're randomized at the start of the game. But for example, if I wanted my leftover money to count for victory points at the end of the game, I could pay $3 to purchase this card, and I can only have one of these cards in each of the columns. And of course, it's also going to take up one of the valuable spots for extra engine building cards. That's essentially how Flatiron plays, but we'll talk about more of the mechanics as we talk about our thoughts on the puzzle. So let's get into that now.
Okay, so the first thing to talk about is, does it actually feel thematic to play? And I'll say the most thematic thing about this is actually the actual building up, because you actually end up with this sort of 3D construction of the building, which is quite cool. And the fact that you have the actual streets around it. I feel like anything after that is very much just like this abstract puzzle. So it's like it looks more thematic. And you build as you're building it, but then the actual gameplay is entirely abstract.
Yeah, and look, one of the reasons why this game was on my most anticipated game list is because the artist here is Webison Santiago, who is one of our favorite board game artists. I do feel like he's a little bit underutilized in this game. There's a beautiful, beautiful cover art, and I really do like the artwork around the building here. But it's, it's kind of abstract beyond that. But I really do love the different levels. And for clarity purposes, I will say the iconography is really clear, and probably because of the lack of art, it's really easy to follow what's going on. So there's two key points of tension in this puzzle, really. The first point is you can't go somewhere where you already are. So if I'm here in Broadway, I must move. And also, you can't go where someone else is. So in this situation, Maggie couldn't go to Broadway and has to go to 22nd Street. And why that's interesting is because we have asymmetric boards where different streets are going to allow us to do things like, importantly, put pillars onto the board. And when you build another level, i.e. when you add a floor or put a roof on, essentially on top of 3 pillars, you get 6 victory points. And so saving up for that event with money and then being the one that gets to do that is really important, but it's all about timing because essentially, and Maggie was doing this a lot to me when we played this game, is Maggie knew, for example, that here, my only way of building a roof is at 22nd Street. So when it would get close to that time, she would simply block 22nd Street and then I wouldn't be able to go there to build the roof. Thanks, Maggie.
But I mean, it's because and then obviously next turn I would have to move. So I'm going to be clearing that up, but at least it can kind of buy you time.
And then the second point of tension in this game is really around long-term or short-term rewards. So long-term planning is buying these cards to build up your engine so that whenever you take one of these street actions or activate a column of cards, you're going to be doing more and getting more, particularly when it comes to coins, which can be a pretty tight resource in this game. So you can build up the engine or you can just race to build these pillars. And the game ends when that roof goes on the top. And that can come around quite quickly if someone is just focused on building pillars and placing pillars out. Of course, you need stuff to enable you to do that. You need to build up your engine somewhat. But in future, I think the first game, we were very short-term oriented. And as the games went on, we realized the power of really building this up and working towards each of these decree cards, which can give you a lot of victory points at the end of the game.
I think the other thing about it is the flow of this engine. It's not like, I'll put those actions there and then I can activate them in whatever order. You actually have to activate from top to bottom, which then means that when you're deciding, okay, well, I've got this card, am I going to use the top ability, the bottom ability? In this instance, they're the same, but and not the same in the sense of like the cost. But the decision becomes, well, one, at what point do I want to, for example, be generating money before I'm going to have an action where I'm going to have to spend that money? And then you also have these the negative reputation where you're like, oh, but if I put it here, that's actually going to cost me a lot of negative reputation, which might mean that I'm going to be losing the ability of making points from that column. It might actually cost me points. You lose 3 points if it's net negative. So I think that's another interesting tension that gets added as part of the flow. The other thing is that we have asymmetric boards. So on the basic side, which is the purple side, the order of the colors of the pillars is different. And the reason that matters is because there's actually points allocated to different colors as you're adding them to the building.
Yeah, and I think that is important because the ones that are most valuable to me, so the teal here, they will give me 4 victory points. They're also the most expensive for me to build. They cost 4 coin, whereas for Maggie, teal is only 2 points and it only costs 2 coin to build. And why that's important is because on each level of the board, you have to have different colors as mentioned. So that helps ensure that we are differentially incentivized to build different colors of pillars.
The other thing is then with a lot of the objectives. So sometimes your endgame objectives might be rewarding you for particular colors that are in the tower. And so you might be like, oh, it's going to be very easy for me to get white pillars there, and I can see that it's going to be very easy for Amy to get the brown pillars. So maybe that can be like, that can inform part of the strategy. Now, when it comes to the other side of the board, there is a more advanced side, which again is asymmetric in terms of the order of the pillar colors, but the first action is completely different on the different boards.
Yeah, and so you lose the action to quickly gain $2, which is really important because we mentioned that money is quite tight, and losing that starting ability to get cash. Some of them do it in other ways, but I think that really does make it slightly tighter and really needs the player to focus on what is the other person's ability and what is yours and how am I going to get money.
Having said that, I think because it's sort of pushing you to be more careful and more strategic, I feel like we have higher scores when we play on the advanced side. I don't know if it's like I'm psyching myself to be like, this is going to be tight, so I better like really pay attention. Whereas when I'm in the basic side, I'm like, yeah, it'll be fine.
I feel like that's
down to me.
Highly correlated with our experience of the game and why we moved to the advanced side, because we got better at the game. So I think that's probably why we had higher scores. So how did the puzzle make us feel outside of making Maggie feel like she can get a higher and higher score just from using the advanced side?
Just from slowing down and going, wait a second, things are tough now. Yeah.
Interestingly, this game, if you like a two-player head-to-head game, which of course this is what this mostly is, Maggie will talk about the solo mode in a little bit, but it doesn't have as much tension baked in. So if I think about some of my favorite two-player games like, Seven Wonders Duel or which has now been reskinned as Lord of the Rings, PS. Or, Paris City of Lights, which are really intensely kind of head-to-head. Every move matters. It doesn't feel as tight here. It always feels like there's something that you can do. Yeah, it might not be the first thing that you wanted to do because someone's blocking you, i.e. your opponent. But it definitely feels like, there's always something I can do to make some money. I can be less optimal, but eventually I'm going to get there.
Yeah. I feel like it's a weird in-between because it's not like a complete no tension. I can go anywhere I want because there's many, many times where you're like, you're in my way, either intentionally or sometimes often unintentionally. It's like, that's just where they happen. Very often you'll be in your own way as well. You're like, I have to move, but I'm exactly in the spot where I want to take the action. And so I agree that it's not as tense as some of those other ones, but it's not without any tension. And that I kind of like, it's an interesting one because it's not necessarily from like a freedom of like, I can move into it. It's just like sometimes you just have this like, so it's like a medium in the way kind of tension.
Yeah, and it didn't quite have the satisfaction payoff that I wanted it to. So it wasn't like at the end of the game I was like, I mastered this game, let's go, or like, let's go again because now I really want to win because you beat me. Yeah. So it doesn't really have that. It just feels like kind of a cruisy game where, yes, there is satisfaction in building up a tableau, but essentially it plays out similarly every game.
Yeah.
And I will say that even though there's a lot of variability in the box, so there's lots of different decree cards, there's lots of different flaws that you can add in. Of course, there's different player boards as well, and there's some asymmetry there. Essentially, because you're just racing to build that tower, build up your engine, it does feel a little bit rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
So I'm glad they put those little touches in there to make it, slightly different each game. But essentially, you are trying to do the same thing, which, there's not like too many different strategies that you can explore.
Yeah. Another thing that I found that kind of slowed it down sometimes a bit is the fact that you have the streets that you're going to be kind of activating by putting your worker there. But then those streets, their decks have different streets on them. So you're like, wait a second. So this one is the same. But at the moment, yes, like for example, if I went over there, if I'm going to 23rd Street, I'm actually taking a card that is meant to go on Broadway. And as this sort of builds up, it does kind of obstruct the view a little bit. So sometimes I might have one of the areas obstructed. So I'm having to like stop and deduce. It's like, wait, so I can see these ones. So it must be this other one. Because there's so many, there's like the streets on your board, the streets on the cards, which will constantly be changing, and then the actual set streets. I did find that often I was like, wait a second. So wait, But, oh, I went there, but no, that's actually not the one that's going to go here. So that actually, I felt like, so even then I just had to like double check. It's like, where does this go? It took me a while to find the flow. So that I felt kind of gets a little bit in the way of the speed and the ease of it, but it's not necessarily gameplay mental energy that I'm spending.
Yeah, but also I would say that this, compared to some other two-player games, and certainly compared to other games by these designers, this is a fairly light experience.
Yes.
It is not a hard game to get into.
Yes.
The iconography, as I said at the beginning, is very, very clear. So it makes it a fairly easy teach. I mean, essentially, I taught you all how to play the game in like a few minutes because it really is that simple. And what you're doing on your turn, choosing between these three different actions that you can do either at a street or city hall, very straightforward. Yeah. And so to get it to the table is going to be really easy. But just depending on your style of game and whether you like a lighter experience that is maybe a little bit less tight than some of the two-player games that we enjoy, that's how you're going to determine whether this is a game for you. I will say that I wish the box was a bit smaller. I love the physicality of building up the Flatiron, but as a two-player game experience, do I want to keep a game in my Calyx or whatever storage that you have that does take up more space than some of my two-player games that I love, which are in a very small box. So that is a bit of a trade-off that you're going to have to make. But anyway, Maggie also checked out the solo mode.
I did. So the way that the solo mode works is you're essentially setting up for a two-player game and you have an automa deck. So all that the automa is going to be doing is you're going to be revealing a card, and then it's going to be, so it usually you can't go where another player is, but that rule is broken for the automa. In fact, if the automa ends up deciding to go, so this is saying the first preference is to go to 22nd Street. So if it decides to go to 22nd Street and I happen to be at 22nd Street, it's actually going to get 2 points. So you are tracking the points for the automa. It's telling you where it wants to go. If it's already there, this is the only time that it won't be able to take that action. It'll just go to its second location that it prefers. And then it's got some kind of main action here, which in this case, it's going to be based on points, based on how many cards with that symbol have already been splayed, because you're going to keep adding to it. So it's like, I'll play this one. So at the moment it would get a point, and then I'll play another one. So when again, it would have to move. So it would have to go to this, to Fifth Avenue, essentially. But when you repeat it, then what happens is that's when it gets to gain a card. And so as it's gaining cards, these are going to be additional points at the end of the game for the automa. The automa, I found, makes quite a number of points along the way, to the point where I was like, how am I ever going to catch up? Because it is going to be, in this case, is going to be just straight up building or adding that block, that pillar, and going to be getting points for it based on whatever their board is, plus usually an extra point. So the way it kind of works is that you'll keep playing until you, who shuffled this? Until you repeat, the second time it repeats a location, that's what triggers a reshuffle of the deck. That's essentially it. But I did find, so it's just kind of getting in the way, removing cards, helping construct the Flatiron. I found that even though you're just really doing a card and facilitating the turn, it's enough to distract me again from, so I need to then kind of context switch to what was I doing and what was my strategy. So it's not the type of automa, even though again, it's fairly streamlined. It's just complex enough in terms of its like the facilitation element that I'm like, it just doesn't, it's not my preferred method. I don't get to just fully explore the game and, in an easy breezy way. Also, it's a more abstract game, so it's not usually the type of game that I thrive in solo wise. But yeah, that's it. That's a solo implementation.
Okay, to summarize our review, my score for this game is a 7.4. It's an easy breezy game that I enjoy playing, but is it one of my favorite two-player games? Probably not, just because of the amount of tension that's baked in. I like a game to be really harsh, especially if it's head-to-head. Okay. So yeah, that's my score. What do you give it?
For me, it's a 7.3, so similar but slightly lower, which so it's like it's a game that I find like it's fine. Like as I'm playing it, it's fine. I wish that for a game that's really just two players, I often find myself having like no satisfying turn, going, oh, well, now I'm kind of like I'm blocked here and I'm ready to do this action. I can't really do it, so I'm just gonna take a distress action of like getting 2 money. So it's like it felt like there should have been more satisfying options for that. So overall, again, I agree with Amy. It's probably not a game that I would be keeping in my collection.
But we hope you enjoyed this review. If you did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll be back with more board game content soon. But otherwise, bye for now.
Bye.